All right, guys, this is Kody Fairfield, the editor-in-chief of the Libertarian Republic. I am here today with Jed Wheeler. He is the vice chairman of the California National Party. They are leading the movement to secede from the United States and, I believe, become their own nation. Is that correct, Jed?
That is indeed the case.
Do you want to give us a history on your organization, who you guys are, and what your goals are?
Yeah, absolutely. So the CNP was founded in 2015. There was a group of 8 people who co-founded it, and it stayed a very, very small organization for the first year. We had our first elections in June of last year, at which our current national chairperson, Theo Slater, was elected. I was elected secretary, and we had another person, Andrea Franco, who was elected vice chairperson. She had to step down a month or so back. She got hit by a car, a hit-and-run driver, and so had to step down due to health reasons. So I became the vice chair after a confirmation vote, and then we replaced the secretary. We also have a treasurer named Justin Hibbard. Our organization has grown north of 1,000 active volunteers, and our Facebook likes, if that's worth anything, is going to take past 9,000 today. And all told, across various social media platforms and discussion groups, we're at about 15,000 active supporters, and that number grows every day. We're seeing just a huge, huge influx, to the point where our biggest challenge as an organization is helping all of the new people get plugged in, and just keeping the wheels on the bus.
That sounds pretty incredible, especially over the short time of period that you guys have been in existence. I just want to go over kind of your About Me page. I know we discussed this on the prep, so just kind of go over exactly what you guys describe yourselves as and kind of your mission statement as to what you guys say your intended goal is.
Absolutely.
So you describe, obviously, that California is not in line necessarily with the rest of the movement in the United States, especially politically. I know that you guys highlight the election of Donald Trump, and that has awakened millions of Californians to how fundamentally different California is politically, socially, from the vast bulk of Americans. I know you guys do mention that this new American administration, these are the words off your website, attacks women's rights, threatens to deport our neighbors, builds walls, and wrecks the economy. You guys put, California is our home, our nation, and the best way to defend her is to fight for independence. You guys do mention that California is the 5th largest economy in the world. There are unique values that California holds that, again, are different from the rest of the United States. You talk about how California gives far more money to the federal government than it receives back.
Yes.
And actually go on to describe that giving of money as subsidization of other states, which would make sense if that's the case. And then you go on to say, and you close it with a 2015 GDP of nearly 2.5 trillion, a population of 39 million, a wealth of natural resources, and a progressive creed and culture that sets the bar not just for the United States but for the world. We are already a major global player. It's time to recognize that and start acting like one. I think those are some pretty bold statements, especially for today's culture. We hear secession movements all the time, and Texas gets it a lot. What makes you feel like California has a real shot at this time, and what's your involvement in the exact Cal Exit movement? I know we've seen that hashtag, as well as the Yes on California.
So let me take those one at a time.
Absolutely.
So Yes California is a separate organization. We have absolutely nothing to do with them. Some of their lead organizers used to be involved in our party. They no longer are. Some of our people used to be involved in their organization. Some of our leaders used to be involved in their organization. We no longer are. Completely separate organization. We are not endorsing their ballot initiative for a number of reasons. First of all, because there's no clear consensus among our members that it's the best way to move towards independence, and we're a democratic organization. In particular, there's concerns about some of the language in that ballot initiative and concerns about the leadership of that organization. So we're just not going to do that. Our strategy is based on becoming California's second party and hopefully eventually California's first party. One thing that's really, really interesting about California that really sets it apart from the rest of the United States is that the Republican Party has almost completely collapsed here. And now that's the result of a number of different factors. And I don't think it's because there aren't a lot of Californians who are interested in fiscal responsibility, for example. I think actually most Californians are pretty fiscally conservative, socially progressive and fiscally conservative. But the Republican Party made some very, very bad choices, positioned themselves against immigrants, and put out a lot of rhetoric a while back about wanting to deport a lot of people. The same sort of rhetoric that we're hearing nationally from Trump right now in California is, in a way that America is not actually a nation of immigrants. More than, well, I think it's about half, and the number changes from year to year. About half of Californians were born somewhere else, and something like a third are born in other countries. So any movement for a Californian identity and any sense of a Californian shared destiny has to take that into account. And so I think that's another key defining factor for our party. People hear the word national in California National Party, and they wonder if we're a far right nationalist or neo-Nazi organization. That's absolutely not the case. We like to call ourselves pragmatic progressives, but we're also very interested in balancing budgets and making sure that the roads get paved. And we don't have, right now we have some of the worst roads in the country. So there's a lot of bread and butter issues, good governance issues, things like that in our platform. And we want to make that a really core focus that sets us apart from the Republicans and the Democrats. Okay. So the strategy is that since the Republicans made those bad choices, and since the Republican Party has alienated so many Californians, and since the Democrats seem to be doing their best to alienate the rest, America's political system is set up first past the post, so you only ever really have two viable political parties. That means that it's almost impossible to be a third party effectively within the United States. So we're not trying to be a third party. We're trying to be the second party, trying to supplant the Republicans as California's second party, and eventually to supplant the Democrats as the first party. And we think that's entirely viable for a number of reasons. California has the open primaries for all elections and the final two, which means people who are on the left or in the center who don't want to risk having a Republican, for instance, get elected can vote for us without worrying about spoiling the race, because if the Democrat does better than us, then it'll be us and the Democrat, or the Democrat and the Republican, right? If there's even a Republican. And in many races in California, there are no Republicans running. So really, we would be the second party. For people on the conservative side, they can do the same thing. There are many conservative areas where people just really, really don't want to risk throwing things to a Democrat, because the Democrats have let rural Californians down pretty badly. And we think that we can be a viable alternative for them as well. So they could vote for us. And, if we don't get enough votes to be number two on that final two runoff, that's okay. It still goes to the Republican and the Democrat. And if we do, then they get a runoff between us and the other party, which means that they didn't have to make that trade-off. They didn't have to vote for a lesser evil. So that's a really big deal, and is one thing that makes California really different. Also, we're focusing on small local races that we actually have a chance to win as a small progressive grassroots party with a lot of very enthusiastic people, but not a lot of money yet. And so we're trying to find the places where we can have the greatest impact given our resources. We're not looking for people's protest votes. We will never run a candidate for United States president because we could win that race. We're looking for people to vote for us based on the strength of our policies, the strength of our positions, and the quality of the people that we nominate.
Well, it sounds like you guys have a very targeted approach, and I think that it's interesting aspect that you guys, instead of taking to the proposition initiatives that like Cal Exit or the Yes on California movement has, you guys are trying to do this through the ballot box, but in a different, more representative way. So that's a very unique dynamic that I think you guys represent. And you did mention that you guys are, hurting for funding and things like that. What are you guys' plans in order to increase that viability through your funding methods?
Yeah, so it's not that we're hurting for funding. It's that it's difficult to fund an insurgent political party. Actually, our funding has dramatically increased, as you would expect, given the increase in our numbers. And we now have the funds to do quite a bit of social media advertising and online advertising. Of course, more money is the right amount when you're a political party or any sort of a movement. So there are efforts ongoing there. One of the big things is that we ask anybody who supports independence and is in it for the long haul, because this is not something that's going to happen next year. This is something that's going to take some work and some time. So if you're in it for the long haul, the way we are, we ask folks to make a recurring monthly donation. And those recurring monthly donations, we have people who are donating $5, and we have people who are donating several $100s a month, just depending on what they can afford. So if everybody chips in, there are 13 million Californians right now who support independence based on the latest polling. That's over a third of the population. And we believe that, there's plenty of money there to do a grassroots campaign funding structure.
Very interesting aspect to it. And again, I think it separates you from all the rest of the movements who are doing something similar. How about we dig into your platform a little bit and discuss kind of some of the areas where you and I might disagree, where other Californians might disagree,
Yep.
but things that would highlight and bring your guys' platform to the people who are wanting something different. You guys have, I believe it's 10 different planks. Of them
Mhm.
are your platform for prosperity, your platform for growth, excuse me, peace and defense, universal healthcare, rule of law, judicial reform, education, immigration, equality, and independence.
Yes.
So we'll kind of highlight each, mainly the top six. The 7, 8, and 9 tend to be a little more nuanced, a little harder to dig directly into. And if there's something you want to highlight in there, I'll definitely let you do that.
Great.
But let's talk about your platform for prosperity, where you guys actually talk about instituting a California credit union.
Yes.
You want to talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, that's actually one of my favorite proposals in the platform. One of the, I think very, very good points that a lot of libertarians make is that national banks are fundamentally unaccountable, and that fiat currency, as supported by these national banks, is not necessarily in the interest of the population as a whole. Now, we can't change the global system away from fiat currency. We don't have that power. Modern currencies float, and that is what it is, even if some of us might prefer, a return to a gold standard or something like that. But we're operating in the real world. What we can do is we can say that the national bank, our equivalent to the Fed, which is our national credit union, needs to be directly accountable to the people of California, and making it directly owned by the people of California is a great way to do that. It's not socialization because the government won't own it, the people of California own it. That's a very critical distinction. Credit unions exist all over California and the United States, and they provide very valuable services for citizens. Because they're not necessarily trying to maximize profit for shareholders, because their shareholders are their members, they're able to offer quite often lower cost services, better, more favorable terms, things like that. And we have a real problem in California in that small businesses have trouble getting access to the financing they need. That is a problem for our economy, in that people, particularly in specific communities, quite often low-income communities of color, don't have access to the banking services that they need. And so you have, payday lenders and very high interest lenders that take advantage of those people. And we think that we could, people end up paying a huge portion of their paycheck just to get their paycheck cashed every month. And that's a real issue. So a national credit union owned by the people of California, with branches in every post office across California. So any Californian who wants one, and it's not going to be forced on anybody, but any Californian who wants one has access to a bank in their community that will provide them the financial services that are required in order to survive in a modern economy at reasonable rates. Now, if people would prefer to keep their banking at some other institution, the market remains in place, and they're more than welcome to do so. And we expect California to remain a major world financial hub. But this gives a great option to, achieve those social justice goals with no negative impact on the finances of California. So I think it's a big win. Other interesting point, and you're going to like this, I think, is that a national credit union or a national bank has the ability to finance debt. So currently, California, at our last election, we passed a $5 billion bond to pay for infrastructure. Now, bonds are an absolutely terrible way to pay for infrastructure. We released a voter's guide that talked about this in some depth. Unfortunately, California's infrastructure is in desperate need of funding, and people recognized that. And so the bond was the least bad option that was available. The thing is, that bond is going to cost California over $10 billion over the life of it because of interest payments. Now, a national credit union could loan that money to the state, since the National Credit Union is not owned by the state but by the people, could loan that money to the Californian government at cost. Or there was an independent article about it. I don't remember the number off the top of my head, but if you Google for it, you'll find how a national bank, or how California could save, I think it was $10 billion on a $5 billion bond. It was the name of the article, and it was published just before the election by somebody not affiliated with us. But I thought it was a really fantastic vindication of this proposal and this sort of model for financing. The National Credit Union can also do things like offer our agricultural areas low interest or no interest loans for things like drip irrigation. Water is quite often the single largest cost that our farmers pay. And, you know,
that pesky smelt. It's that pesky smelt.
Well, you can blame the smelt, or you can invest in infrastructure that will actually address the issues.
Correct.
I mean, quite a bit of California's water infrastructure, and we address this in the Platform for Growth, which is our infrastructure platform, but quite a bit of our water infrastructure has not been maintained in decades or more. You know, some of those big water pipes haven't been maintained at all since they were laid in the 1890s, right? And California loses billions of gallons of water every year as a result of leaking infrastructure.
Right.
And so if we can fix our infrastructure, we can remove this constant battle between farmers and fisheries, because both are absolutely critical for our economy and both play a role. And we don't think that it should be a fight between farmers and smelt. We think it should be Californians working together to, you know, fix our country and make sure that we have what we need to succeed. Anyway, back on the point of irrigation, low interest or no interest financing for drip irrigation would save, again, billions of gallons of water, which would allow us to weather our droughts and allow us to move more towards water security, and it would save our farmers a huge amount of money over time. So there's a lot of stuff like that the private sector, it's not profitable for the private sector to make those loans, and the private sector should never be forced to make loans that are not profitable or put into that business. That's not their business. Their business is to make money for their shareholders. But there needs to be some institution that is capable of making those loans, providing that financing, so that we can achieve specific goals that are required for our financial well-being as a nation.
I want to move on to another thing that you guys talked about, and it tugs at my heart, and then it kind of pushes away. You guys talk about simplifying the tax code, which I absolutely love. Yes. But then you talk about a more progressive tax code.
Yes.
Could you explain that a little bit?
One of the really interesting things, and you know, I studied once upon a time political science, and it was a degree from San Francisco State, which maybe because of the tech industry here, is really a data science degree that focuses on politics. I ended up working in a data science industry, not politically related, but that's what I do for a day job. Anyway, I deal with numbers and I deal with facts all day long. This is my world. And one of the really interesting things about tax policies is that we have this idea, sort of neoliberal credo, that cutting taxes for the very, very wealthiest people will create trickle-down wealth, and it'll spur investment and all of that sort of stuff, Reaganomics. The thing is, it doesn't actually work. In practice, cutting taxes for the very wealthiest people without spreading that around increases inequality and hurts the economy. Now, you might say to yourself, why does that hurt the economy? That's so weird and counterintuitive. You would think that people, you know, if rich people had more money to invest, they'd invest it and they'd create more jobs. What actually happens is that people get to a certain point and money isn't money anymore. It's just a way to keep score. And so rather than investing that extra money, they just hoard it. They stick it in high interest accounts. They pass it on to their kids, grandkids, great-grandkids, whatever. However, if you have set the marginal tax rate on those very, very top earners a bit higher, what happens is it's no longer cost effective to keep that money. It's no longer cost effective to take that extremely high salary. The reduction in that top tier of taxes is one of the direct correlations with the massive increase in CEO pay relative to the pay of the rest of the workforce. I mean, CEO pay has absolutely gone through the roof in the last several decades relative to what the rest of America makes and what the rest of Californians make. And you can make some arguments in favor of that, but fundamentally, is the goal of the economy to allow 0.1% of our population to have more money than they could ever spend? Or is the point of our economy to move goods and services around in an efficient way and make sure that people, you know, our society can function? We believe it's the latter. So you increase that marginal tax rate on the very, very top group of people. And instead of giving themselves massive pay rates, they decide to invest that money because they can't keep it, right? It happens consistently And this has been studied across dozens of nations over the course of decades. It's not an issue that's actually up for debate if you look at the numbers. If you increase that top marginal tax rate, you see a significant rise in investment into the creation of new business. Startups, for instance, find it a lot easier to get funding, and that's a big part of our economy here in California. And you see a concurrent rise in standards of living and rise in average wealth. And so you bring up the entire economy. And it's not that the federal or that the government is taking that money and redistributing it, because you can keep it so that the entire amount of taxes that's collected stays about the same. So you don't have necessarily a net increase in tax revenue per se. What happens is that it's a function of how taxation operates that makes the difference. So we've actually done quite a bit of research there, and it's something that we think will spur the economy.
Right, and I think that opens up the conversation, and we'll kind of glaze over this real quickly because I don't want to get bogged down in it, of what the role of government fundamentally is. Because I know that, at least from the libertarian perspective, you would have people contend that the government, regardless of its intentions, good or bad, doesn't have the right to regulate somebody else's wealth. But like I said, I think that you guys address that issue from the thought process that if government has this role, this is how it's best to be done. So it's definitely an interesting perspective, and one that I personally haven't heard. So that information is definitely appreciated. I do want to move forward onto, there's a couple other things we could spend a lot of time on in your platform for prosperity.
It's pretty deep.
It is, and that's also appreciated, like I said, and I complimented you on this before we started, that you guys clearly have put some serious work into your platform, more so than almost any movement, especially when it comes to propositions or political parties that are startups, that they have in the past that I've seen. So with that, though, I kind of want to move on to some area where we may agree a little bit more, and that's your peace and defense. And you guys call for neutrality in the world, and to me that sounds like drawing back this interventionism and the ability to try to police the world. Would that be a correct statement?
That is absolutely correct.
Would you like to go into your guys' viewpoint or your worldview and how this would be applicable for you guys?
Fundamentally, it's about representing the views of most Californians, and having a foreign policy that actually represents Californian values. That's one of the interesting things, is California, of course, pays the largest share of the United States military budget. Our contribution to the U.S. military budget for this year are slated to be $61 billion. That makes us one of the 10 biggest military spenders on the planet. And we have no control whatsoever about how that military is used, how that funding is used. We also provide the largest number of troops to the United States military. So in terms of troops and treasure, we are disproportionately contributing and disproportionately unrepresented, as on most issues, which is, again, reasons for independence. So if we were to have control over our own military, what would we do with it? And if you look at the votes of Californians and the opinion polling over time, what you'll find is that most Californians don't want to be the world's cop. It's not our job. It's not our place. It's not an appropriate use of our power and resources. I think perhaps more than people in other parts of the United States who are a bit more sheltered, Californians are much more likely to know somebody who came here from a war zone and to have a much better understanding of what it means to have bombs fall out of the sky and kill your children. Americans don't seem to get that. They don't seem to understand that that's a crime, that murder is murder. So we have the right to defend ourselves, and we will absolutely defend ourselves. We are not interested in murdering other people's children.
So it's more of that peace through strength, or strength through peace idea.
Yeah. So Switzerland has been neutral for centuries, and our peace and defense platform is based on replicating their model. So it's a militia model. It's a citizen army. Every citizen of California is a member of the armed forces. You go in for some basic training. When you come of age, you go in for small amounts of training over time. Everybody knows how to use a gun. Everybody knows how to defend themselves. I think that's something that a lot of libertarians will actually like. And as a result of that, because we don't have to have a massive standing army, because we have a citizen army, we're able to save many billions of dollars. Based on the financial analysis we've done, we'd save about $40 billion a year by moving to this model. And that's all money that can either be, not taxed and given back to the people, or spent on things that we actually need to improve our quality of life. And it's up to the people of California how they want to spend that peace dividend.
I just wanted to make one highlight there. That the libertarians would love the fact that we're all trained with guns, but they would definitely argue on the kind of thought of conscription and the force registry. But like I said, that's an
That's
argument that
absolutely
can
true.
be made at a different
You know,
time.
and that's actually, I think, the most controversial point in our entire platform. And we went back and forth and we spent hours on it at our platform convention, going back and forth about it. The compromise we came up with was that anybody who doesn't want to serve in the military has the right to serve in some sort of a Peace Corps for some period of time. And here's the thing: you can't have a citizen army without citizen soldiers. You can't. And so the only way that we can minimize the power of the state, the coercive violence of the state, which libertarians oppose, is to put that power into the hands of the people. And this is the only practical way to do it. So there's a trade-off there. There's always a trade-off. But we've tried to err on the side of liberty and on the side of empowering people.
Okay. Moving on to a further point in, I guess, what would be considered your foreign policy or worldview approach. You guys discuss making sure that the United States remains an ally. How would you guys go about separating the military bases that are owned by the federal government in the United States and maintaining that relationship with the United States?
So one of the interesting things, if you look at independence movements, the Philippines, for instance, was an American colony for a long time before they gained their independence. And one of the conditions of their independence was that the United States would continue to have access to those military bases. Now, we're aiming for a peaceful and democratic separation from the United States. And that means that we need to be willing to make concessions as well as be firm on some things. So one of the things that we're willing to concede is allowing the United States to continue to rent the key military bases, because they are absolutely not going to give up their access to Pacific ports. It's not going to happen. So great, we'll rent those bases to them. We have some positive impacts to our economy from having the soldiers stationed here. It helps cement our alliance with the United States, because we want to have an alliance for mutual defense. We want to have a strong, friendly relationship between neighbors. We're not aiming for any sort of an antagonistic thing. So we let them keep their military bases, or at least most of them. We're going to need some, of course, for our own military. And we're going to need to rebuild some. Vallejo, for instance, is a community that was absolutely devastated by the pullout of the naval base on Mare Island. And we'd like to bring that naval base back up to speed and modernize it and use it for the Californian Navy or Coast Guard.
It's very interesting
approach.
Yeah, that's a very interesting approach, and I think it actually, if you look at like the history of the Philippines and places like that, it does very closely mimic how they separated themselves and relaying a mutual relationship still existing.
Yeah.
All right. Well, let's move on to your platform on universal healthcare. I know this is going to be somewhere where at least our viewership is going to have a lot of contention for you, especially because it looks like it may be a step further than the current healthcare system under Obamacare, the Affordable Care Act.
I'm actually not a really big fan of the ACA. I think it's arguably a lesser evil than what was in place before and what's going to be in place under Trump, but only on some criteria. And I'm absolutely opposed to the individual mandate. I think charging people fines for not being able to afford health care is morally reprehensible.
Well, the ironic part about that is I believe the IRS just said that they'll allow people to file taxes even if they didn't meet even if they didn't meet the healthcare standard that they were supposed to in order to file taxes. So that's an interesting take there too. But could you explain how your model, and you guys listed as a single-payer model, one will be funded, and explain your relationship to the French model and the non-for-profit aspect of it?
So the French model is really, really interesting because it's a market-based universal healthcare model. And I think this is actually a really key point that'll maybe help smooth out some of the fears that libertarians would normally have towards a single-payer system. One of the big problems with the single-payer system, as we understand it from Canada, for example, is that the government owns all of the hospitals and employs all the doctors there. And what that means is that you have it's much harder to get access to a specialist because you have a lot fewer of them, and there's a whole range of issues there. Now, in favor of the Canadian model, they pay less to provide universal health care than we pay to regulate privatized health care. So in terms of cost, universal health care can actually be significantly cheaper than our current approach. And that's something that a lot of people don't recognize, is that because of just the incredible waste of the United States government and the fact that funding for healthcare comes from 10 different programs and you've got all of this overlap in regulatory structure, there's a huge amount of waste. And so the French model, the French actually spend about half per person of what Americans do to get universal healthcare for all people. And it's a market-based system, which means that they keep the efficiencies of a market-based system. They keep the ability for specialists to practice and to get very, very good at a specific thing. They keep consumer choice intact, all of these sorts of things. So the way the French system works and the way our proposal would work is that, so are you familiar with Kaiser Permanente?
Yes.
They're actually a nonprofit. And so they're maybe an example of something like this. And Kaiser has a lot of really interesting efficiencies that they gain because the insurer and the hospital and the doctors are all part of the same organization. So they don't have any incentive to overbill you or, recommend things that you don't really need to run up the cost so that they can make money because they're not profit driven. So you take nonprofit institutions like that and you have them compete in a free and open marketplace, well regulated. The government, as the government of virtually every industrialized nation outside of the United States does, that government would set the, through negotiation, not through decree, but through negotiation, the prices to be paid for instance, prescription drugs or specific procedures, and then it's up to consumers to determine who they want to provide those services. So consumer choice is intact. You can go to your doctor, you can have your doctor, you can go to this hospital and not that hospital. And from the perspective of the person receiving healthcare, it's all of the best aspects of our current approach without worrying about, am I going to lose my home because I got sick?
Now,
this is a really big deal because the leading cause of bankruptcy for Americans is healthcare debt, and that's under the ACA.
Correct.
That's something that Obamacare did not fix.
The question that I have for you is that, you just said if you like your doctor, you can keep your doctor. Are you holding yourself to the same standard that President Barack Obama did, or is there a different aspect? Because obviously understanding that there are for-profit medical institutions, how do you guys go about either having them in the medical field, or is there a coercive action that the state would take in order to force them to not profit?
Yeah, so for-profit medical, basically we're changing the structure. We're changing the game board. So we're moving from a for-profit model where that's the standard to a not-for-profit model. And we're keeping the marketplace, but definitely for-profit companies, if you own stock in HMOs, for example, you would want to pull that stock out before this proposal goes through, because that's going to go to zero.
Right. That was the clarity I was looking for, is that how this would affect, I guess, the private market and the people who have investments in that.
Here's the thing. And it comes back to what is the role of, in this case, healthcare. Is the role of healthcare to treat sick people and to help people get better so that they can be healthy? Or is the goal of a healthcare system to make money for investors? If your goal is to maximize the profits for investors, then we have an absolutely amazing healthcare system. And all of the people who lose their homes or who can't afford the prescriptions for the drugs they were prescribed or who lose their life savings or all of those other things, which are real and significant harms to actual individuals. These are not abstractions. These are real people who are being hurt. All of those things don't matter if you assume that the only goal of healthcare and the only responsibility of a healthcare system is to make money for shareholders. Now, we believe that the goal of a healthcare system should be to provide healthcare and to provide the best level of healthcare possible for the most cost-effective and the most cost-effective arrangement. Is going to implement a market-based approach that provides real choice, real consumer protections, all of the benefits of a market-based approach, and no Californian will ever again lose their home because they got sick. Now, we think that's a price worth paying. You may disagree, and disagree is part of the democratic process. And so if keeping profits for shareholders is your absolute top issue, don't vote for us.
Well, and I think that's a great point you make too. Again, it comes down to what the role of government is. I know that a lot of our viewership has read Bastiat's The Law, and he would make an argument that government's role is simply to exist, not to provide service. So that would be the argument on our side. Obviously, we will gloss over that simply because I want to be able to fit the rest of your guys' time in and use your time wisely. Obviously, if you ever want to come back and have the discussion, I'm more than happy.
I'd be happy to. Yeah, I'd be more than happy to.
All right, well, let's move on to, I believe it was under the rule of law. You guys talked about your opposition to the Patriot Act, which makes my heart flutter. You guys talk about judicial transparency. You guys are against torture, which is great. And
I don't understand how any person in the year 2017 can say that they're okay with torturing another human being.
Well, I can tell you there are a lot of things in this political climate that I do not fundamentally understand how we get anywhere. But I digress. It exists. You guys talk about the involvement in an international criminal court. Obviously, reinstating habeas corpus, which has been suspended under the War on Terror.
Yeah.
Another thing that a lot of our viewership will love is that you guys believe in whistleblower protection.
Absolutely.
Banning civil asset forfeiture without due process. And
one quick point on whistleblower protections,
yes.
And I think that your viewers are going to agree with us here. Law and morality are not the same thing. And I believe, on a very deep level, that there is a moral obligation to break unjust laws. And if somebody breaks an unjust law, reveals criminal behavior, we as a society have a debt to them. And the minimum payment for that debt is not prosecuting them for revealing this criminal behavior, for revealing this harm that's being done to us. So understanding the difference between law and morality, and understanding that we have a responsibility to people who are willing to step out of line. Now, it may be the case that sometimes somebody blows the whistle on something that they think is unethical, and society says, well, actually, that's just fine. We don't have any problem with it. And by the way, you violated your non-disclosure agreement, and that is what it is. But if somebody reveals criminal behavior by the government, the right to speak up and reveal criminal behavior by the government is a fundamental human right and something we defend.
So would the state of California then grant Edward Snowden the asylum that he has been granted in Russia?
If the CNP was in charge, absolutely yes.
I just had to get that on record because our viewers will love that as well.
Yeah.
And you guys do talk about especially in California, this is a big issue with the terrorist attack in San Bernardino, the banning of backdoors in technology. For people who are unfamiliar, the government wanted access to some Apple phones that the perpetrators of that terrorist attack had, and ironically, the government locked themselves out of their own phones and needed a backdoor key. So that's interesting that you guys, you guys oppose that too. Those are things that we definitely can find common ground on, and
absolutely.
I think that, for the most part, you guys' rule of law is very, very pro-civil rights. It's very, very pro-individual in its protection. Do you have anything in terms of your rule of law that you would like to hit on more specifically? I know we just went over the whistleblower protection, but is there anything else you'd like to cover real quick?
Yeah, so I think the backdoor protections that you mentioned are actually a really, really big deal, both from the consumer protection angle, the individual right to privacy angle, and also, to be really mercenary and pragmatic about it from a economic angle. California's economy is a technology-based economy. Most of the world's big technology companies are here. Most of America's technology companies, not American technology companies at all. They're Californian technology companies. Let's be real. And those companies, there have been several studies on this, and you can do a little bit of, spend some quality time with Google, and don't trust my words. Don't take my word for it, but spend some time with Google and look up the amount of money that Californian technology companies lose every year because of the war on terror. The international markets don't trust our companies, our technology companies, because they know that those companies are subject to coercion by an out-of-control federal government that has no regard for rights to privacy. And that harms us as individuals, and it harms our companies, and it harms our economy.
I would agree. They actually take advantage of blanket warrants too, like we've seen with Verizon and all the phone companies in terms of getting access to caller data. So those things, like I said, I think there's a lot of common ground there.
Yeah.
Moving on to your judicial reform, and this is kind of the last one I want to pinpoint, and then I'll let you kind of go through education, immigration, equality, and independence if there's anything there that you would like to talk about before we end this. But in your platform for judicial reform, you guys mentioned that you want to mandate that all police body cameras are mandatory, and that the interfering with its availability to record would be something that is, I believe was it prosecutable?
Yeah.
Okay. You guys want to eliminate mandatory minimum sentencing. You are for a statewide standard, and now I'm blanking on this. I'm misreading my notes. It's use of force. Sorry, statewide standard for use of force for all policing agencies. You believe that juveniles should never be tried as adults, and the best one that I think our viewers will definitely be up in arms about, not up in arms, I'm sorry, they will be applauding, is your want to end the war on drugs.
Yes, absolutely.
With that, can you discuss with us, your view on the war on drugs, especially in California, and how you guys would take that approach?
Yeah, so the Portuguese and the Dutch have very, very successfully decriminalized drug use, and we believe that addiction is a disease, and that it should be treated as a disease, and the data supports this. Again, we're trying very hard to be pragmatic in our progressivism and adopt data-driven solutions. And the data shows that locking people up for being addicted to things doesn't stop them from being addicted to things. They just get the drugs on the inside because, parallel markets exist. All it does is it fills our prisons, it empties our coffers, it drives an incredible amount of corruption. It provides a direct incentive for the owners of, for example, privatized prisons, which we want to abolish, to make campaign contributions to people who will fill those prisons. And that's a direct assault on the liberty of the people. That's not acceptable. It's fundamentally, it's about, again, what is the role of the state? What is the role of government? And our belief is that the state is perhaps a necessary evil. But to the degree that it is a necessary evil, we should only employ it where it's absolutely necessary, and we should make sure that it's there's as little evil as possible. And so making sure that there's full accountability. Now, at a first read, this platform might come across to some people as anti-cop, and that's absolutely not the case. We believe that the majority of police officers are good people who are doing the absolute best they can in an incredibly difficult job. They're not supported, and whistleblowers and people who stand up face incredible hostility. People who try to create change, positive change in those environments, quite often face incredible hostility. And we want to empower the people who, if you see something, say something. If you want to be a whistleblower, say something. So one of the interesting things in here is, if you're in a police department and you're a cop and you see something unethical happening, you don't have to go and talk to your captain. You can, but you're not required. That's not the only recourse to file a complaint, because we know, I live in Oakland. Do I need to say anything more? We know that quite often a local organization can become corrupt, especially when you deal with use of force and you walk that thin gray line every day. So somebody who's a whistleblower should have the ability to go and report on that action to an independent body that's answerable to the nation of California, and file that complaint where it can be independently investigated. Sometimes there will be merits to those complaints, and then we can make sure that we police the police, that we have the appropriate watchers, and that we support the people who are trying to do a good job. And sometimes there will not be merits because people make false complaints. That's a thing that happens in the real world, right? But we want to make sure that the process for investigating those complaints is transparent, that it's effective, that it doesn't punish people who are trying to reveal wrongdoing, and that it doesn't shield people who are trying to commit wrongdoing. Are more likely to use lethal force than police just about anywhere else in the developed world. And police in other countries receive extensive training on how to use de-escalation techniques, on how to subdue people without the use of lethal force. And our officers are not receiving the training that they need. And that is California and America failing our police officers, is what that is. We need to make sure that our officers have the tools they need. And in return, once they have those tools, we need to hold them accountable and make sure they use them. So that's really what it comes down to.
I think that's a very interesting distinction that you make, too, in that just because you want to hold police officers accountable, that does not make you anti-police. And I think that's a message that people who criticize police departments definitely need to start raising a little bit more.
Yeah.
So moving on through the rest of your platform, is there anything else that you would like to kind of highlight that I maybe won't be? I know I want to talk about immigration with you just because of, current day events, but besides including education, immigration, your equality and independence platforms, is there anything you would like to touch on real quick before we move forward?
Yeah, so one big thing is the platform for growth. And there's a lot of detail in this, and I would encourage your listeners to check it out. California has some really, really big challenges in terms of infrastructure. Our water infrastructure, as I mentioned earlier, is in very, very bad shape. If you go through the Central Valley, you'll see these big signs talking about how, the drought is the result of bad government. And liberals, coastal liberals are like, what are they thinking about? Do they think government made the rain not fall? These crazy, rural people. And actually, the science have a point, which is that by failing to invest in our water infrastructure, the drought and things like it have been made tangibly worse. It's a fact. And so we want to make those investments, fixing the pipes. And there's a range of other things, desalination is a last resort. It's very expensive, but it is something that we can move to if we need to supply the needs of our coastal urban areas. Fortunately, most of our densest populations are right on the coast, which means getting desalinated water to them is logistically relatively easy. Desalination is not necessarily a good option for watering crops inland, however. So we need to have other tools, atmospheric dehumidifiers, making sure that we use the water on our farms efficiently. I mentioned our plan to help farmers upgrade to drip irrigation and reduce consumption responsibly and in a cost-effective way. And one other thing that the Israelis and other countries that live in arid or that are in arid climates have done effectively is water capture. So we've got all of this rain right now, and in the Bay Area where I live, it's all going straight into the bay, and that's crazy because come summer I'm going to need water to water my garden, and so mandating that new construction include water capture is perhaps a small imposition on builders, but it allows for our entire water grid to be much less subject to, the fluctuations of weather, because we live in a zone where semi-regular droughts are part of our climate. I mean, I've lived in California my whole life, and we have droughts and we have very wet years, and they alternate back and forth, and we have to prepare for the droughts. We can't just every year be like, oh no, this is so unexpected. What do we do? Because preparation, I think that's something that your listeners will agree with me on. Preparation and self-reliance is the best approach to a vulnerable situation.
I would agree. So let's move on. Let's move on to immigration. It's kind of the hot topic right now, especially after Trump's executive order, which you guys mentioned directly in a press release titled "We Build Opportunities, Not Walls." It was released on January 30th of 2017. It leads off like this. It says, California has always been a home of immigrants, and throughout our history, we have celebrated our great diversity. The executive order of the President of the United States to build a wall along the southern border is simply a waste of resources. This ridiculous proposal, like so many of its campaign promises, has no logic or economic sense. We also denounce their ban on Muslims as illegal, unconstitutional, and do not represent our Californian values. Immigration and diversity is far from harming our society. It strengthens it. And with that, I kind of want to see if I can get your take on if you've heard of SB 54, the Sanctuary State Bill. It's pushed forward by its California Senate Pro Tem Kevin De Leon out of Los Angeles. If you've heard State Senator Joel Anderson out of San Diego, who was actually with me last week, in his comments that it actually shields felons and hurts other even illegal immigrants who are here by allowing these felons to stay in the state, and what your take is on Trump's response to defund California of their federal money that comes in that helps with either immigration situations such as deportation through ICE and things like that.
So first of all, in order for Trump to defund California, Trump and the federal government would have to be funding California. That is not the case. The federal government robs California blind. We pay on average, and it fluctuates from year to year, somewhere in the neighborhood of $50 to $60 billion a year more in federal taxes than we receive back in federal spending. So actually, if anybody was going to defund anybody, California should defund the federal government, which is on our list of things to do. So when you hear Trump use that rhetoric, it's not about let's punish California for being out of control. It's about him attempting to seize our assets and not return them. That's fundamentally the social contract with the government. Is you pay something in taxes and you get it back in services. So he wants to take our taxes without returning the services, which is something that should have every libertarian outraged, frankly. So that's that. As far as this specific bill, I have not gotten into the details of this specific bill. I've been spending all of my waking hours that aren't spent on my day job that actually pays my own personal bills, building an organization from nothing. And I don't necessarily have time to read every bill that comes out, although I would love to. I'm an absolute political wonk. What I will say is, and I think this is going to resonate pretty strongly with your listeners based on my reading of your website, is that rather than talking about sanctuary states, and maybe a sanctuary state is a good option in the short term. Like I said, I haven't read this bill. One thing that would make a lot more sense to me long term is having a much more open borders policy. One thing that's really, really interesting is California has, for a very long time, since we were part of Mexico, has had a constant flow of workers from Mexico into California to pick our crops. We're a massive agricultural producer. We're the largest agricultural state in the nation by a huge stretch, half of America's fruits and vegetables. By the way, we're the fifth in terms of receipts of funding for agriculture. Our farms are definitely get the short end of the stick from the federal government in terms of crop subsidies, which is another issue for our rural areas. But point is that those agricultural areas rely on migrant labor. They always have, and that's a fact of life. So we need ways to ensure that people who want to come here to work, to contribute to our economy, to help support this incredibly important part of our economy, have a way to do so. And that they can do so with dignity, that they can earn decent wages, that they are treated like human beings and not as though they were disposable, because human dignity is non-negotiable. It's not. That said, we don't necessarily need to offer them all the chance to come here and move here and live here forever, because here's the interesting thing. A lot of them don't want to. A lot of people would prefer to come and work for a season and then go home to Mexico or wherever they're from originally, where the cost of living is considerably cheaper. And there is a direct correlation between increasing border security and more people choosing to stay. And the reason is because the cost of getting past that border security is so intense that people have to go into extreme amounts of debt to finance coyotes to get them across the border. And then they have to stay because they have to work for 5, 6, 7, 8, 10 years in order to pay back that debt for getting into the country in the first place. And by that time, they built a life here. So then they stay. Right?
Yep. Makes sense. It definitely makes sense. And, I like I said, your guys' take on this is very well in depth. And wherever we may disagree, I appreciate your knowledge and what you're bringing to the table. I think that for me specifically, and I think for our listeners, that open conversation, open dialogue is always a great thing. And,
absolutely.
I think we've shown here just with this conversation that wherever we may disagree, there's civil debate to be had, but we can bring things to the table where there is common ground, and I think that's important to highlight as well.
One last point on the immigration point, which is that we do support a path to citizenship for people who want it, but we think it's also important to recognize that not everybody wants it, and that there is absolutely a place for a legal, well-regulated migrant worker program that defends, the rights of the migrants and provides our agricultural sector with the labor that they need. So there is a reasonable solution there. Okay. As far as where to find us, CaliforniaNational.Party. You can also find us on Facebook and Twitter if you just search for California National Party, or CNP is our acronym. Be aware that there is an individual over at that other pro-independence group, Yes California, who's engaged in some amount of criminal fraud against us because he's trying to co-opt our name and use it to raise money. So there is a website out there for the Californian National Party with an N at the end. That is not legitimate. We've sent a takedown request to the social media sites that he put up for that. Those sites have been taken down. The website is going to come down at some point as soon as our lawyers work it out. In the meantime, though, it's California with an A, California National Party. And here's the thing. We're not the Libertarian Party for independence. I think that a lot of libertarians are going to support independence. I think that in the multi-party system, which we hope to create here in California, one of our other proposals that we didn't have a chance to get into is switching towards a proportional representation system instead of a first past the post system, which would allow for multiple parties to be viable in California. And so we hope to get there soon, and we hope to have fruitful dialogue with the Libertarian Party and with libertarians in general, both now and in the future. We think that on many, many issues, we're natural allies, and we look forward to working with you on areas where we agree.
That sounds great. I've been speaking with Jed Wheeler, the Vice Chairman of the California National Party. Jed, thank you again for being here, and hope to talk to you soon.
Absolutely. I'd love to come back.